Welcome, everyone, to tonight's New York Technology meeting of the User Experience track. Delighted to have you all here. I'm Eric Roman. I'm the Executive Director of New York Technology Council. And we've got two great speakers, one of whom is here and the other is on his way. So we're going to start with the one who's here. But first, let me quickly go through and thank our sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be here. We have a number of partner organizations. I won't go through them all, but part of what we do is bring together various parts of the New York tech community. We've got 4 media partners at this point. And special thanks to Frankfurt Kurnit for providing the space and their generous sponsorship. With that, I'd like to turn over to Charles Mauro, who organizes this track. Charles?
Thank you. Thank you. I see a lot of familiar faces here and a lot of new faces as well. Welcome to the NITEC UX track. Just a, new clicker here. We've set up on Twitter and we're also set up on Facebook. So if you're interested in the content in this specific track, follow us on either 2 of these social media sites. Just a quick note, our last session we had several requests from attendees for the actual citations from Paul Thurman's lecture. And so we put these up on Pulse UX. These are the 50 most important peer-reviewed publications on UX and usability. And you can look at those now. And those are all the references from Paul's lecture. Just a couple of quick points here. This is the first in the UX series. Part 2 is the science of interaction. We have Josh Clark. I don't know if any of you have heard Josh speak before. He's very engaging, very well versed in sort of the psychology and the basic science of mobile UX design. And then we have the optimization models. We have a speaker, David Fine, who's here tonight. From Time, he's head of UX there, and we'll have another speaker. And then the final part is simulation and design. So we're going to be running this mobile series over the next about 4 months. Okay, so I'm going to skip through Tim, who hasn't shown up yet. Our first speaker, you know how Google is. What are we going to do? Okay, so I'd like to introduce Jason Farman. Actually, I came across Jason. I don't know if any of you are really interested in sort of the theory of mobile, but he wrote this book last year, and his publisher sent it to me for review. It's a tremendous book on mobile theory, and so we contacted Jason. He's currently at the University of Maryland. And he agreed to come up tonight and talk to us more about the sort of the theory and social structure and impact of mobile. Just very briefly, he's currently associate professor at the University of Maryland, a distinguished faculty member. He's basically just really a smart guy and knows what he's talking about. He's written, as I said, this particular book is definitely worth picking up if you're interested in the more sort of theoretical aspects of mobile. It's a topic which is not well written about at all. He's got a bunch of other scholarly articles, all of which tend to be quite interesting, especially his work on storytelling. And he has his PhD in media studies from UCLA, but welcome him to the East Coast. So here we go. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, great. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I look forward to speaking with you afterwards. Otherwise, if you'd like to get a hold of me, my website is jasonfarman.com. Also, you can get a hold of me at Gmail or on Twitter at Farman. But do feel free to chat with me afterward tonight. So the title of my talk this evening is Mobile Interface Theory for UX Design. And the talk is primarily drawn from the introduction of my book, Mobile Interface Theory, and touching on some of the core things that got me interested in this field and really where I see the foundations to be and where to go from there. So a few of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight, the scope of my talk is going to discuss why I think anybody should begin with a broad cultural and social context before starting any project. I think this is a really fundamental foundational thing. Begin with the cultural and the social context that frame all of the mobile technologies we're working with. I'm also going to touch on how can the history of mobile media give us insights into its future. I'm going to then trace that to this present moment and ask, well, what is new about right now? What is unique about this moment? And finally, I'm going to look at a topic that's of interest to me to ask, what about creative misuse? What can we think about when we're designing for mobile in terms of creatively misusing some of the mobile out there? So much of this is drawn from the introduction, as I said, and for the book, I was initially designing and talking with the publishers about a couple of possible covers for the book, and I thought they were really relevant, so I wanted to show them to you to start off with. So these covers obviously didn't make it, and for really interesting reasons related to the talk today. So the one on the left here is a mock-up I sort of threw together, and I sat down with Routledge to talk about this, and we said, this is completely wrong. This cover does not work for what I'm talking about. And primarily, the issue is she's talking into the mobile phone instead of staring at it. And this is not what I'm talking about in the book at all. And Howard Rheingold, in his book Smart Mobs, begins with that idea. In 2000, he was in Japan, and he had this epiphany where he was standing on a corner, and he looked out, and something struck him. He said, everybody here is staring at their phones instead of holding them up to their ears. This is a big shift that's happening. And that was back in 2000 when he wrote this. And I think we've just seen this more and more. And this really hit its nexus in 2009 when, for the first time globally, people started using their mobile phones more for data transfer than they did for voice communication. And that trend has continued since then. We're talking less and we're texting more. We're connecting with each other asynchronously rather than synchronously, and this is a continuing trend that's going on. So this image just absolutely didn't work for the cover, so we got rid of it. One of the covers that was a possibility in terms of inspiration was the cover of a couple of colleagues of mine, Rich Ling and Scott Campbell, wrote this really interesting book, Reconstructions of Space and Time. Highly recommend it. And I was talking to the publishers about this kind of approach, and I said, please, 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 for the love of God, don't put a cell phone on the cover of my book. The moment it hits the shelf, it's going to be obsolete. It's going to say, look at that big clunky phone. Obviously, what's ever inside there is obsolete. It's out of date. Why would I want to read this? I said, please don't put a phone on the cover of the book. So these 2 points, I think, are interesting in terms of why we're starting the mobile UX design series this way. Why start with a cultural? And the reason, from my perspective, is that I'll touch on some specifics, and Tim, when he arrives, will touch on some specifics as well. And throughout the series, we're going to have some really specific recommendations for mobile UX design. Absolutely, within a handful of years, those specifics will be out of date. These will be obsolete. So for me, the question is not necessarily the specifics about mobile design. What I'm really interested in and where I want to begin is, instead of thinking about the devices, let's look at the activities that contextualize those devices. It's not about the devices, it's about an activity. And when we tap into that activity, then what we're talking about has a much longer shelf life than the cell phone right here, or even the iPhone, or the particular device, or the particular interface. The particularities of what we're talking about do have a limited shelf life, but the context, the activities that make those interfaces and those phones and those devices specifically interesting and used and utilized by a broad public, those activities are ultimately going to have a much longer shelf life than the specifics of what's going to be covered in the next 3 sessions beyond this, and even the specifics of what I'll talk about today. So that's why I want to begin here. It's less about the device and it's more about the activity. It's less about the specifics and it's more about what draws us to those things in the first place. And when I began to think about writing a book about mobile media, one of the big questions was, how do you possibly write a book about one of the most rapidly changing technologies on the face of the planet. This is a huge challenge. And for my own scholarship, I just didn't want to be outdated that quickly. I mean, we change phones and mobile devices more rapidly than almost anything in our lives. People are constantly shifting their devices. In 2007 alone, there were 426,000 mobile phones retired in the US every day. And so what we have is a huge culture of obsolescence, and at the same time we have a huge culture of a huge shifting culture. It's hard to actually write something, put it in print, and imagine that it's going to have a long shelf life. And ultimately, this was the answer that I had, that ultimately I am interested in looking at some specifics, but only in how those specifics can ultimately tell me something about the activities that make those devices interesting and meaningful to begin with. So for me, I want to begin by looking at the history of mobility, the history of mobile media, which is vast and can really tell us a lot about our current situation. And I think if we're going to define mobile media and begin to define it broadly and define it historically, we have to begin very far back. And I would begin here with clay tablets and papyrus. As soon as a medium goes from being static to mobile, huge cultural shifts happen. So you don't have to go to the place to read the inscription comes to you. And the shifting of connections, the shifting of communications across geographic spaces where we can send a message, the message, you don't have to come to the message, is a huge shift that happens in culture. So what we have here is a Mesopotamian clay tablet from 605 BC. On the right is a picture I took of papyrus from 125 AD. This is at the Rylands Library in Manchester, UK, that has, I think, one of the biggest collections of papyrus in the world. And this leading to paper, leading to books, leading to mobile forms broadly. And I think it's worth beginning here to imagine and to realize the cultural shifts that we're talking about right now with mobile technologies have many precedents. We are not necessarily in this isolated moment of a huge cultural shift because of mobile media. This has a very long historical trajectory. And I think it's really useful to tap into that and to realize the cultural shifts that have happened throughout history. And in understanding that just as we don't have to go to the place to get the message comes to us. Right now, when I call my wife on her cell phone, I usually ask her, "Where are you?" But 20 years ago, that would have been just an absurd question. She would have said, "You know where I am. You called me." Because we would call to a place. Now we call to a person. So similarly, what we're having is mobility and connections are happening in ways that are transforming our relationships to communication, to connections, social connections, and there is a long trajectory of this, a rich history which we can tap into. And I think also similarly, if we trace this up to our current moment and begin to think about the relationship between these two things, but then also with the things in my wallet perhaps, to imagine the relationship of mobility, mobile objects in your life. I think there's a lot of value there as well, to begin to think about the ecosystem of mobile devices, mobile objects in our lives, especially the ones that are so intimate we carry them on us all day long, and how those ultimately transform the texture and shape of our everyday life. There's an interesting art project by an artist, Jason Travis, who lives in Atlanta, called Persona, and you can find the full series on Flickr, where he got 120 participants to come and have their portrait taken, and then he asked them to empty their bags or your pockets, put them on the table, show us what you're carrying around with you. And the idea is that the things that you carry with you on a daily basis that are a part of your everyday life, so integral to the shape and the texture of your life, tell us a lot about who you are. This is Cassie. And you can really tell a lot about her. She's got, the obsolete Game Boy here, and she's also got opera glasses, and I think she's kind of identifying herself through obsolescence in a way, and beginning to embrace that obsolescence as a sign of her identity. This is Randall, who has all of his stuff with his initials on it, very orderly, very neat, different kind of persona. It would be fascinating to just go through the room right now, actually, and ask all of you to dump it out. Maybe we'll do that afterwards. If we end early today and Google's not around, I'll go around and take your pictures. But it would be really fascinating to say, okay, well, what does your stuff say about you? And I think when we are thinking about mobile media broadly, defining it broadly and the usefulness of that, it has to include all of the different objects that we carry around with us in a day, and thinking about the relationship of my mobile phone to the Metro card in my pocket, and ultimately thinking about the ways that those objects are interfaces into the world. They are interfaces into what the shape and texture and character of my life ultimately is. There's a fantastic quote from Sherry Turkle, and I don't quote her often, but I will tonight. We think with the objects we love the objects we think with. And I think there's something really valuable to this idea. We think with the objects we love. So ultimately, the objects in your life, mobile media being part of them, and mobile objects broadly are absolutely part of them. They are the objects with which you encounter the world and understand the world. And ultimately, they will be gateways to your understanding of the spaces that you move through. They will be the gateways to your social relationships, and ultimately the ways that you come to identify yourself. The very nature, the very core of your identity comes through these objects. We are intimately bound with these objects, mobile media being part of it, the mobile computing devices being part of it, and ultimately they really do create a specific relationship to the spaces that we move through. So I think there's value in a broad definition of mobile media, because I think beginning there gives us a broader context, and also it gives the lineage of this broad mobile media and the ecosystem with which where it lives ultimately can give us a much bigger data set on people's on the cultural shifts that are happening because of mobile media, than rather to look at just mobile computing since the mobile internet. There are massive precedents for this, and I think they can give us some fantastic insights. And part of this comes from the idea that's called remediation, that these tools come from somewhere. And I think we like to sometimes think that the latest and greatest idea is just sort of this light bulb that pops over someone's head and it's like, wow, and that shifts culture completely. Somebody came up with a mobile internet and we've been transformed ever since. Somebody came up with certain touch gestures. The pinch and the zoom has changed my life, and I will never be the same. Where instead, what we have are these things come from somewhere. There is a long history to where these things come from, and this is a part of what's called remediation, that an old medium tends to conceive a new one. And ultimately, there's a long line that we can trace in that. And I think if we begin to think about the lineage of this device, of a mobile phone specifically, a lot of people would point to the landline phone as its predecessor. But I think when you begin to think about the ways that we're using our mobile devices, maybe a handful of years ago, if we go back to that image right here, a handful of years ago when our mobile interactions looked more like this than like this, that may have made sense. But I think tracing the lineage of this to the landline phone doesn't quite make sense anymore in that way. I think it looks more like the pocket watch, actually. If you want to think about where this thing came from in terms of the social practices, it looks more like the pocket watch than it does the landline phone, because ultimately it is a device that you carry around you all day long that shifts your relationship to time, and it shifts your relationship to space, and ultimately it shifts social relationships in a drastic way. In terms of you have time on you, all of us right now are on the same second. At least potentially, we could be on the same second. And living in the second is an experience that really, prior to the standardization of time and the ability to take time with you wherever you went, living in the second just was not an experience anybody had. So you and I could say we're going to start at 6:30, and we're going to start at 6:30. And if we're late, we experience that duration very differently because of something like the pocket watch. And when we have these mobile devices on us, and they ultimately shape our relationship to time, they change our social relationships where time becomes money because it's calculable. Everybody's got a very standard time that they've got on them. We don't need to go out and reference the clock tower or the clocks that are around. We've got it on us at all times, and ultimately you can standardize that and turn that into time being money. So it changes all of these relationships, and I think ultimately when we begin to think about mobility and to begin to thinking about devices that we carry on us that shift our relationships to space and time, I think the pocket watch is maybe the better ancestor than the landline phone. And I think if we think about the future of mobile media, it will continue to tap into those core characteristics that mobility and mobile media shift our relationships to space and to time and to our own bodies and to our social relationships. And I think the future of mobile media will continue to look like that because it has historically up until this point. So prior to this, to think about our relationships to space, especially when it came to the internet, there was a growing sense, and very much early on in the days of public internet, it was advertised as such that the internet collapsed geographic distances, that I could connect with somebody in Denmark or Japan in an instant. Geographic boundaries and borders, it didn't matter. It was collapsed. We connected in meaningful ways. Geography no longer mattered. There's a really interesting MCI commercial with young Anna Paquin, who's in True Blood and other X-Men and things like that. It was the first thing she ever did. She was in this MCI commercial where she's standing in the desert. And the tagline for the MCI internet commercial is, "There will be no there will only be here." So we're not going to go there. Everyone is here. You know, that's the internet. We're all here. So in a sense, the early days of public internet was about the collapse of geographic space. And I think what mobile media is doing is exposing that as really a false idea, because location matters. Location matters, and what we have is the rise of proximity. And thinking about what's local and what is contextually relevant to the place I'm at is highly influential in terms of mobility, because these are spatial media we're talking about. These are spatial media. We take them with us, and ultimately one of the most powerful things that these media tap into is the ways that they inform the spaces we move through, making the spaces contextually relevant, making the spaces we move through rich with information. And this leads to something I call information landscapes. And what an information landscape is, it does a couple of things. So the first thing is the place that you're at will affect the content you're interacting with. And this has always been true. The place you're at will affect the content you're interacting with. Imagine reading a book in various settings, at a concert, in a quiet park, while you have screaming kids running around you that you have to take care of, they're hungry, it's lunchtime. The place that you're at will affect the content you're interacting with. So if you're reading a book, that is ultimately going to always be affected by the place that you're reading that book at. That's always been true. And also in terms of accessing the internet, this has always been true. Geography matters to your experience of the internet. The actual infrastructure of the internet will always affect the outcome of your experience. Recent studies have interestingly shown internet speeds on the coast of the United States versus the center as being dramatically different. The farther you are from a research university, for example, the slower your internet speeds are. And again, we're in this duration where we live at the second. And if that duration is shifted a little bit, the experience of the internet is altered as such. Location will affect the content you're interacting with. Likewise, someone in a particular region will have very different interests than a person in a different region. Location matters in terms of your experience. The place you're at will affect the content you're interacting with. Secondly, the content you're interacting with will affect the place you're at. And this is one of the shifts that I'm seeing with mobile devices. The content you're interacting with, what you're looking at, will affect the place that you're at. So here we're bringing the content and making it affect the space around us. We're taking the information and making the place itself transformed because of that information. And this, I think, is a huge shift that's happening, something that I term information landscape. The landscape around you is full of information, and part of that information, access to that information, is through mobile devices. So tracing the history for me of this and thinking about mobile media broadly is a really core foundation for that, but I think it is ultimately an incomplete picture. The next thing I would recommend for people to ask about is medium specificity. What do these media do well, particularly in comparison to the ancestors that brought them? You know, what does this technology do differently? And I think that that's a key question to ask. In remediation and thinking about the genealogy of our tools and our technologies, when an old medium conceives of a new one, what tends to happen is that new medium pays homage to the old one. It tends to mimic it. It tends to look like it and try to emulate it in a lot of ways. This was true of television, for example. Early days of television, there was a 3-camera system where you had a camera here, over here, and over here. And the idea was, one of the things that we liked about TV was its liveness. It was there, it was live. Broadcast television, in terms of it actually being recorded, didn't happen for years and years. So essentially, the way people thought about television was it was theater in your home. You didn't have to go out to the theater. You had theater in your home, and you had the perspective of the three cameras emulating what it was like to sit around in the theater. And obviously, our television is not theater any longer. What happens is the medium realizes what it does well, what it does uniquely from its predecessors, and it embraces that and it takes off. And ultimately, remediation is about a new technology finding its own footing by understanding what it does uniquely well in comparison to previous technologies. And one of the things that I think this applies to in terms of mobile media is medium specificity has to drill down to the pinpoint within the mobile media ecosystem to look at a mobile technology on its own. So in other words, although I like to define mobile media broadly, when we're thinking about medium specificity, if someone says to you, I need you to design something for mobile, and we're talking about these things, we're talking about miles different. You know, these are not the same thing. They do things very differently. And medium specificity is a way to tap into that, to say there are affordances and constraints of every medium. But if we're talking about mobile, we need to be very specific about that and understand that within that ecosystem, certain things work with different devices, and we need to anticipate that and we need to embrace that. I once went for a job interview. First job interview I ever went on included taking over the university's newspaper, because I had worked in newspapers prior to starting my career in academia. And they wanted me to take over the paper and really kind of continue on with the website, because they felt the web was a really important component of the student newspaper. I said, oh great, can I take a look at the website for the newspaper? So they loaded it up, hit the URL. There's no website. What loads is a PDF of the newspaper from the previous day. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And the idea was that, you know, for them, it's like, well, it's a newspaper. You just throw it on the web or on print, you know, it doesn't matter. It's the newspaper, you know, they'll take it either way. Rather than really thinking about what does that technology do well, what does print do well, what does the web do well, and embracing that through medium specificity. This does this well, and we're going to embrace it, and we have to tailor it accordingly. And along those lines, one of the things that I think is vital for this is that content is not seamlessly transferable between media. And I see this all the time, that people want to take that content there, throw it on mobile, or take that content and put it on the web, or take it and print it. That absolutely ignores medium specificity. It doesn't embrace the unique characteristics of these technologies. And I think what we need to tap into is that these technologies have affordances and perceived affordances. Donald Norman has a great series of books on this very topic where you look at a device and it has affordances. It has certain things that are obviously you can do with them. You look at it, okay, there's a button, there's sliding, it's a touch gesture, etc. Those are the affordances. And the constraints obviously are that when I compose an email, I'd rather do it on my tablet than on this, or if I'm writing chapters of the book, I usually do it on a platform that is easier for me. I am terrible at typing on this thing, and I'd prefer not to, but I'm even worse at typing on this thing. So in a sense, figuring out what are the constraints, what don't these media do well? I think that's really vital. So these technologies are spatial, they're social, they could create information landscapes, but what don't they do well, I think is just as important of a question that needs to be asked. And when we don't embrace this idea, users notice that. Users notice the inability to embrace medium specificity. And noticing that, I think, taps into something that I'm finding particularly relevant too, which is what this era is really becoming, which is the dawn of ubiquitous computing. So ubiquitous computing in terms of these technologies weaving themselves into the very fabric, sometimes quite literally, of our everyday lives where we have microprocessors in everything, and everything has data associated with it. My Blazer, that camera, they're all interacting. Mark Weiser had when he was working on this project, really imagined technology being so pervasive that it became invisible, that it really was about us interacting with information environments that just were smart environments that we didn't have to necessarily interact with in a way that we knew about, that we really understood as we were interacting with it. One of his famous quotes is, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of our everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it." And this is not happening. Ubiquitous computing is happening, it's just not looking like this. Instead, we're interacting with a ubiquitous computing environment that's very visible. It's very visible, we're interacting with it in visible ways, and we like that. We really embrace the visibility of the mobile and pervasive environment that we're working through. This was a project by Pacific Northwest National Labs called Precision Information Environment, and they were trying to imagine mobile implementation for crisis management. This example that they used was for firefighting. And they designed an entire system that was hands-free because you have firefighters out there and they need to get information. So you've got this mobile wrist-mounted device that will send you information from a home base. And the idea is you could take that map, throw it up onto the windshield. It will guide you through where you're going. And I knew the guy who was the lead designer for this. And one of my questions for him was, why are you building an entire system from the ground up when there are over 6 billion mobile phone subscriptions around the world? Everyone has them in their pocket. We have a ubiquitous and pervasive computing environment right now. It is the most pervasive technology, digital technology, on the face of the planet right now. Mobile phones are the most pervasive. I said, why aren't you tapping into that? Why aren't you embracing what is ubiquitous computing now rather than trying to build something from the ground up? Utilize what exists. And I see this over and over. The PNNL, who works with the government, works with Homeland Security, this is often, these projects are very similar, one after another, where they start from ground zero. You know, we build from the ground up an entirely new system. Instead, my question that I raise here, and I think is important to ask, is how do we then embrace what has become the ubiquitous computing and pervasive computing environment around us? So the visibility, I think, that's happening because of what ubiquitous computing has become is ultimately about the pleasure of working with these devices. The visibility is the pleasure of that. And part of that, I think, is imagining what virtuality has become. So in virtual worlds or virtual reality environments, you would go into a digital space and it would replace the physical world. Now we're taking our digital environments out into the world, and we're augmenting the spaces around us through digital technologies. And thus, I think the term virtual is kind of losing a bit of cachet, because virtuality doesn't necessarily, the ways we're using it, tap into our experience of taking our computing with us where we go and augmenting our environments through that. But what's interesting for me, the ways that we're using the term virtual is really not the historic ways that the term has been used. It actually dates back to the 1400s, and the term virtual has always implied an experience of layering, an experience of doubleness, and the pleasure of that. It often referred to a religious connection to the metaphysical, so a relationship between the physical world and some other metaphysical realm. And the experience of virtuality was the meaningful intersection of those two things. And I think this is really applicable to our experiences of mobile media in space and place. The playwright Tony Kushner, who wrote Angels in America, among other plays, I think gave us the best definition of the virtual, which applies to this. He was talking, he came to the University of Maryland and gave a really fascinating talk about his work, and he was describing the end of Hamlet. So Tony Kushner has nothing to do with mobile in terms of, he's got no relationship to the topics, but when he was describing Hamlet, I said that's our experience of mobility. At the end of Hamlet, Hamlet's running around the stage, sword fighting with Laertes. And it's this massive stage fencing battle. He gets stabbed by Laertes, and he falls dead because the tip of the sword is poisoned. And what happens every single Hamlet at the very end? You've got this actor laying dead on the ground who's just been running around the stage with sword fighting, and he's breathing like super heavy, but he's dead. But we weep, in a sense. It's this tragic, tragic moment. So what Tony Kushner said is the pleasure of the theater, as the pleasure with the virtual, the pleasure with this layering, the pleasure of visibility in terms of our mobile media, is the experience of doubleness. For him, he said, I'll sit there and weep watching Hamlet. I look up there, there's an actor, he's breathing heavy, he's acting, I know he's acting, but on that stage is Hamlet, and he's just died. And I know both of these things at the same exact time, and it's powerful. And that ultimately is what the virtual is about, is this experience of layering. And it's the pleasure of that. Ultimately, when we think about a lot of the things Weiser was arguing for, the disappearance of that, it doesn't embrace that. It doesn't embrace that visibility, that doubleness. The idea is that we really enjoy that layering process. We enjoy the virtual as it's brought out into the world. And I think what the visibility ultimately points to, and one of the things that I think is particularly powerful, is the potential for creative misuse. So the visibility of this leads to the ability for people to misuse the things that you guys are building, for example. In everyday life, there tends to be a certain trajectory. We have the shock of the new. The new thing comes out. We've never really seen anything quite like this. It's remarkable. And then what happens? We have broad adoption, assimilation, and it becomes mundane. So one of the questions I ask is, how do we get back to that shock of the new, especially with such an intimate technology as something like a mobile phone? Something that you do carry on you. It's probably one of our most intimate technologies. So I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, but this is the first thing I touch in the morning. I've got my wife sleeping next to me, but my alarm goes off. I touch this before I touch my wife. And it's such an integral part of our lives, and we use it. We really we get very used to the ways that we use our devices. Sometimes it's really shocking, as as user interface designers, watching somebody else do something is mind-blowing. And I think one of the questions I have is, how do you get people to take that the most intimate technology in their lives and take it back to the shock of the new? How do you get them to look at it in a totally new way and say, I've had this thing for so long, I've been using mobile phones, since whatever year, and I never thought to use it that way. And that ultimately, I think, is creative misuse, is one way to do that. The power in getting people to use their devices in unexpected ways. And ultimately, I think this doesn't necessarily always come from the top down. I don't think you necessarily have to design that because ultimately your intentions are not necessarily the best ways that your product is being used. A lot of times the best ways that something is used is the ways people take it and go, okay, I understand the concept of what you're doing there, but I'm going to do this with it. And that sometimes gets embraced, and it becomes a really powerful way of using it. I think even a very simple example of using Twitter, I've been on Twitter since it launched, and to see the vast number of ways that it's been used since it's been out has been mind-blowing. People have taken it and creatively misused it. And I think ultimately, keeping in mind that building in the flexibility to allow for creative misuse is a really fantastic option. I think this is a fundamentally great way of getting people to think about different ways of using their devices. And in part, I think, thinking about the various ways that people use these devices and building in the potential for creative misuse, one of the things I recommend too is learning from the global uses of mobile media, which are absolutely mind-blowing. I have a lot of colleagues who work in mobile media around the globe, and last summer I was at a conference sitting and listening to them talk about the various uses of mobile media around the world, and it just looked nothing familiar to me. It's just seemed like, are we talking about mobile media? Because I feel like I'm, I kind of know what's going on with mobile media, and this doesn't sound like mobile media. The global uses of it are really impressive. And to begin to look from culture to culture at the ways that people are using these devices around the world is a really fantastic way of thinking about how to get people to use these technologies differently, to surprise people with the potentials for their most intimate technologies. So a lot of this that I've touched on, as I mentioned, is in the introduction of the book. And since I'm not necessarily going to be able to chat about the rest of it, I wanted to give you a sense of the other topics that I'm willing to, maybe we could have Q&A about, or we can chat about further. In the book, I jump from here to talking about the role of maps in mobile media, and broadly thinking about the value and the importance of spatial representations. The ways that you represent space will always affect the ways that people use that space. The representations of space and the uses of it are so integrally intertwined that I think they're inseparable. And also, I touch on locative social networks, location-based social media, the rise of that, what that's looking like, and also mobile games, performance in the arts. I touch on reading interfaces and storytelling projects. My next book that's coming out this summer is called The Mobile Story, and it's about people using these devices to tell stories in site-specific kinds of ways, to get people to tell the stories of their communities using these devices, and all of the arts projects and narrative projects that are happening around mobile media and storytelling. And then I conclude the book talking about information overload, progress, and obsolescence, sort of those core problems of mobile media, and to begin to think about some avenues that advocates for mobile media can address some of these problems. So with that, I'll end, and thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, why don't we take some questions?
Okay, great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Regarding your media specificity section, you were talking about the content is not seamlessly transferable between media. There's a real uptake in what's hot right now is responsive design. Could you touch upon that, or more?
Well, can you expand? Again, I'm coming at this from a very different background, not necessarily.
In user experience design, there's a lot of different design groups or whatever working with responsive design so that they can build once and then display on all different devices. And that is good in a way because then it gets the content out there, but then it can be frustrating because if the design theme that has been created is responsive coding doesn't quite transfer, it's a trade-off.
Yes, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that sometimes, I've seen responsive sites. I think even Google's mobile playbook is an interesting example of, really working well on a tablet and being designed as such. And then there's other examples where responsive design is a band-aid. It's like, well, people are going to look at your site on a mobile device. It's got to be, the font's got to be right. And what that doesn't do in terms of medium specificity is say, well, why should they access the site on a mobile phone? What is going to be the value of that? Is it that the font's going to be correct or the images will be displayed correctly? It's going to be easier to navigate that site. It does nothing to really tap into the very core question, what does a mobile phone do well, and why should my website be on a mobile phone to begin with? What should that experience be about? And I don't think that responsive design always answers that question.
So again, media specificity. To me, the thing that mobile does so well, or is beginning to do much better, is all the sensing it can do.
Yes, right.
I recently got a heart rate monitor, and it has a trainer. Okay,
Yeah.
and I'm listening, I'm running, and she says, "I can't see you, but I know you're doing well."
Wow.
Now the thing is, it's a recording. Okay?
Yeah.
But she does know what my heart rate is
right.
doing.
Yeah.
And so that experience,
Yeah.
and at first it felt like, wow, this is a really cool trainer, and then it was like, wow, this is a really cool interface,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and it really was because of the sensing, and I think that is going to explode.
Yeah, no doubt.
So
Yeah.
any thoughts on?
Yeah, and I've just recently written about the PlaceMe app that basically takes all of the sensing in your mobile phone and just does it nonstop. And the idea is that your location matters, but also your speed, your trajectory, whether it's day or night, and the context of the brightness of certain things. And it's really interesting to think about the potentials there, and then contrast them with the opposite uses. You've got people who want to sense everything. You've got people who want to tap into all the data that their mobile phone can tell them about their lives. And then you've got like one of my graduate students who works at a domestic abuse shelter, where they give you a phone that calls 911 or the shelter. Location awareness, no, it's not in the cards. You cannot have a contact list. And it's interesting to think about the range of uses when it comes to the sensing, and ultimately that there will be a market for tapping into that. But at the same time, there's a huge contingent of people, even when I talk about locative services, that just don't want anything to do with people knowing their location. And I think, I've seen this change in my students over the years, but, and I'm down in Maryland, not in New York. I think the answer would be different if I was in New York, but I ask my students, how many of you are on Foursquare? And I rarely have a hand raised. And this is surprising to me because I'm an addict when it comes to Foursquare. I love the ability of my phone has to tap into all of these sensory options. And it's interesting that to understand why certain people don't want that. They don't want to be sensed. They don't want to be tracked. They don't want location awareness, and location privacy is an interesting counterpoint to that, I think.
Yeah. So, maybe I thought it was great because there was a great presentation, and I thought you talked about some really cool aspects. But social, do you think social, that you're not really alone, that this is connecting to others, and the impact of that on how you look at the world?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, not all of those things are the same in terms of weight.
Mm-hmm.
How would you weight some things over others? Like, I think social is really transformative, right?
Yes,
It's
right.
changing
Yeah.
the way we tell our stories. It's
Yeah.
changing the way that we look at ourselves.
Exactly.
So, which are the ones that are? Is there some hierarchy to some of the things you're saying, or is it?
Yeah.
Are they all kind of?
I think they're context dependent, because social matters in certain situations and doesn't necessarily have the same impact. I think social is an integral part of everything that we're talking about. I don't think you can imagine something as not being social. And to go as far as to say, my relationship with my objects is a certain type of social relationship, actually, and when I'm alone, there's huge social aspects to that. But social takes on a different texture when we're talking about certain interactions rather than others. And I think all of these are spatial, though. I think we can't imagine the social without the spatial. because we're in space. We're defining the texture of that space. All of you walked in here and sat in these chairs, which are all facing forward, without questioning why. You know, there's a certain assumption of the practice of space, but if we had done something differently, if we had changed the arrangement of the chairs, it would have set a very different social space. And we produce that space. We are constantly shaping the texture of social space. So you can't imagine social without spatial, and you can't imagine all of these without our own human bodies, you know, and the ways that we think about these. So they're all intertwined. I don't think you can separate them, but based on the context, they take on certain weights. When I'm in front of St. Peter's and I'm loading up, you know, the history app that shows me a historic photograph of it, you know, the spatial takes on more aspects. And then when I tweet that, you know, the social rises to the surface. So it's highly contextually dependent, I think. Yeah.
So I'm interested, you had mentioned some of the things from a global perspective that surprised you or caught your attention. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
One of the things that first struck me was what the mobile internet looks like in South Africa. And it's a Java-based interface. It looks nothing like the graphic user interface of my iPhone. And when they showed me the Java-based platform that all people use in South Africa for the mobile internet, my mind was kind of blown. I heard a guy talk about the uses of Bluetooth on the London Underground. It's a book called Gaydar Culture. And what he talks about is people make their Bluetooth discoverable, and maybe they do this in the subway here, I don't know, but it's a flirtation thing. It's kind of like Grindr, but in a more sort of literally underground kind of way. If you look and somebody has a little note on their Bluetooth, you can send them a message, and people flirt and hook up on Bluetooth over their phones. And you know, I thought Bluetooth was hooking up to, you know, my earpiece, not hooking up quite literally. So yeah, just these the payment systems that are happening in agricultural Africa through mobile phones, people beginning to develop savings because of mobile exchanges of currency is pretty amazing. And even people within the same culture using their phones quite differently, I think is expected, but still fascinating, you know, to track some of that. So those are just ones that came to mind off the top of my head. But.
Yes.
What lies beyond touch? So like right now we can do voice dictation to our phones, and Leap Motion has the very cool gestures you can do without touching. Yeah. Touching is very like personal because I can do it and no one knows exactly what I'm doing, but the other options that seem to be out there have some other social consequences to them.
Right.
Like you don't want to tell your phone what to do in front of other people.
Right. Yeah.
So what's kind of what do you foresee in the pipeline for that?
That's a good question. I have assumptions, and again, I think the difficulty in answering that, which I'll give you my ideas, but the difficulty in answering that question is that we don't tend to notice the things that make up our everyday life. You know, we take them very much for granted. The pinch and zoom, for example, and touch tends to be taken for granted, or a swipe, or things, you know, certain gestures that often are understood as just common sense. That's the way you would zoom. You know, that's just the way you would do it. They become so standardized, so embedded in our everyday lives that it's actually difficult to step out of that. So for my students, when I try to get them to see beyond that, the project that I'm having my students do at the end of the semester is take a technology, specifically a mobile technology, and use it in a way it's never been used before. And I mean, you can imagine, this is, you know, that brings sort of sighs in the crowd. I'm like, how in the world am I going to do that? It's a tremendously challenging activity. Use it in a way that no one, you know, it's not meant to be used. That's all they have to do. Take it, use it in a way that's not meant to be used. And that, I think, is one step towards thinking about what's beyond touch. You have to somehow pull yourself out of that everydayness of touch. I think you have to pull yourself back from it, looking at it critically. Again, I have a performance studies background, and so I tend to pull from that. Bertolt Brecht was a theater practitioner who, when he put on plays, he made everything totally exposed. Like, you could see the lighting fixtures, actors would come out and set up things, and they would talk at the audience. The idea was, you always have to be aware of the mediation in order to have critical distance. If it's too immersive, you don't look at it critically. So I think that's the challenge for people to think about what's beyond touch as one example of a question, you have to have that critical distance in order to do that, and that's a tremendously challenging thing to imagine. The projects that I point to for students that look beyond touch, for example, are things like the Sixth Sense coming out of MIT, imagining a mobile device that becomes a part of you. You know, it's got a pendant and it can sense gestures out here. You can take a picture by doing this, and so on and so forth, as one possibility beyond touch. But I think you point to another interesting dilemma about that is, do I want to be, hey, everybody, you know, and, you know, doing these kinds of gestures. And these, you know, again, this is the shock of the new. If I actually did just take a picture of you, that would be tremendously cool. And it would be like, wow, that's an interesting, different way of thinking about mobility than I've thought about, and it will become assimilated. I think it's managing those two things, trying to find that critical distance to be able to answer that. And I'll leave that ultimately up to you from from beyond here.
Other questions?
Would that make it, I was thinking Google Glass or something like that, either would make it more efficient or less efficient, when you're not dealing with an interface.
Right.
You're literally speaking to the device, is it more efficient to help, your machine?
Right.
Rather than actually create.
Yeah, and I think that, again, depends on the context with which you're interacting with. So I bought this phone a week ago, and I'm glad Tim's not here because it's an iPhone. But you know, I've been trying to find times to try out Siri, you know, because I had a Android device before this, and it is odd, you know, trying to find those times where it's more appropriate, where it is more efficient to use that, and I think it is really contextually dependent. And again, I think the thing in terms of education that actually applies to this, that I tell people when they're trying to implement technology in the classroom, is that students and users broadly are absolutely honed into tech for tech's sake. You know, to implement a technology simply because it's the latest, and it's actually not the most efficient. I think those technologies just die at the wayside, and I see this in the classroom quite a bit in the university setting. People are like, digital media in the classroom, and they try to just, you know, employ it without really any thought for, you know, whether it's more efficient or not. For example, I had my students, so I got this iPad when I first started teaching. I had never touched an iPad prior to this, actually. They gave it to me a month before I had to go to the classroom. They say, use this in the classroom. All of your students have them, and we expect you to use it in some interesting and dynamic ways. And I was like, okay, this will be interesting. So I tried everything. I was like, you know what, this will be a laboratory. Let's find out what works in education in terms of mobile media. So one of the things I set up was taking quizzes on this, where all the quiz questions popped up on their screen. They took the quiz, and then it got sent to the content management system, filtered through, graded for me, you know, and then it spits out all the data. And one day I forgot to set up the quiz, and I was like, dang it, I didn't do it, because it was really laborious to actually set it up. So I shot off a Word document, I went down and I printed out copies, and then at the beginning of class I handed out a paper quiz, and you could hear like the sigh of relief. It's like, oh, this makes sense, you know, and we love this. And honestly, it was my fault because I wasn't quite using the technology correctly. I was actually implementing quizzes throughout the class, so they had to pause what they were doing, jump over to the other app, take the quiz, jump back to Twitter, jump to their notes, you know, and things along those lines. But all that to answer, I think tech for tech's sake immediately honed in on, and I think we really tap into that. And sometimes, you know, I tell people in the education field, but I think broadly, sometimes a digital medium is not the answer for that problem, you know? And that, I think, is a hard thing for some people to hear, especially when we're so married to digital media the way we are.
I was watching a review of the Samsung S4. They were commenting that whereas hardware and software have kind of gone neck and neck on this, on this one, the hardware is a small increment, but the software is a big increment, and especially the eye control.
Yeah, right.
Comment on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I haven't read that, and it will be interesting to see again, going back to the sensing idea, how we navigate these tools. And I think ultimately, from my perspective, what the things that I'm interested in are how these technologies are shaping our sense of our own bodies, when the ways that we're navigating these things, especially if you're able to use the eyes to navigate, use different senses to navigate the interface, is really going to shift our own relationships to our bodies, ultimately, I think. And that is a pretty profound shift. And I think technology historically has done this. We've had very significant shifts of our own sense of self and our own sense of communities because of mobile technologies pretty broadly. Yeah, but in terms of the hardware and the software, yeah, I think it's really just, again, I don't think it's necessarily about the specific tools. Again, the implementation of a particular technology, again, it will ultimately be outdated. I think what's powerful is if we can tap into the motivations behind these practices, what really clicks with people, and why. And linking that broadly in the broad history of mobile media is a really fascinating journey to take. And if these emerging ways of navigating on our phones or mobile devices emerge, how will they be situated? Will they be, does it make sense based on the long history that we're heading here rather than here? I think is an interesting question to ask.
Staying on the Samsung announcement for a minute, one of the things I heard them say was that the phone would have the ability of, if you held it up close to your ear, it knew you wanted to make or receive a phone call.
Right.
And you didn't have to touch anything
Yeah.
to do that. So that kind of fits into
Yeah.
what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Having an intuition for what the body is doing. Even I think with the heart rate, having a certain connection to the body. It's continuing to take our mobile devices to more and more intimate relationships with our own bodies. They're already, there is, I think, something to be said that for me, I put this in my pocket and the phone sits against my body all day long. And when you're in contact with a device for that long, you really do have a shift in your own sense of body and how that body then can connect out into the world broadly. And I think that we'll continue to see that, the push towards the intimacy of the technology, but hopefully even finding ways to make people aware of that, hyper aware of that, for us to have a little bit of critical distance, find new ways of doing these things, find ways of critiquing that, which, over and over again, I think since at least 2010, we've seen a huge pushback in mobile, in terms of people feeling that we're disconnected, we're connected more to our devices than we are to other people, and so on and so forth, that these are too intimate of technologies, and I think for advocates and designers of mobile media, it's important for us to argue for the ways that these devices are actually making us connect deeply with our spaces and with people and even our own sense of self, rather than connecting off into the ether somewhere. Yeah, in the back.
So I see the title on the screen right now, Mobile Interface Theory for UX Design. What I'm hearing when you're talking about physical objects and devices that we're using, it sounds like it's almost the majority of them, and then there's this thing, I don't know, desktop computer server somewhere. Like, is there going to be a point when it would make more sense to drop the word mobile there, and the other thing would be called something else?
The other thing being?
Everything else, like servers or desktop computers. I mean, mobile to me is like, it's just, if it's an iPad and this, they're completely different. It's the way I access my stuff.
Right. And so categorizing them all under mobile actually does a disservice in a sense?
And it forces you to think about it in a certain way that does, you're putting them in this category together that they may not belong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the commonalities of the two in terms of the mobility aspect, the portability, rather than simply the transportability. There's lots of things that are transportable. We can all take this podium outside or this desk, but it doesn't mean we want to carry it with us all day. The things that are portable really do have an impact on our everyday lives. So I think the mobile is essential in terms of tapping into the cultural shifts that are happening because of these things. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation that perhaps media from here on out will be spatial and mobile in meaningful ways. And I think that is something to consider. And at the same time, when one of the things that's been sort of an interesting intellectual journey for me is tracing what actually happens on my phone. I was at a data center in Northern Virginia, which is one of the main places. About 95% of internet traffic that in that region of the country goes through that building, Equinix Internet Peering Point, and we have one here in New York as well. And while I was there, I checked in on Foursquare, and the guy said, "Oh, Foursquare's databases are here in this building through the Amazon cloud." And I said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "That's so weird. I wonder what that check-in looked like. You know, I wonder where my data went. You know, so I actually did a whole mapping project on it, like tracing where did the signal from my phone go, and you know, it hit an antenna, which then shot it off to a cell tower, which linked into the infrastructure of the fiber optics, which then sped out, you know, right over my head actually in these trays into this server, going back out and shooting it." And what was fascinating in terms of that journey and in terms of your question is that at least half of that journey was based on very static infrastructure. Mobility is founded on very static towers, hardwired lines running through the ground into these massive buildings that consume tons of energy. When I was in there, you could barely hear a conversation because the air conditioning was blowing so loud, keeping these servers going nonstop. And the guy said, yeah, if there was ever a natural disaster or a terrorist attack, the hospitals would get the gasoline first and we would get it second. Because it's so important that the internet stay running in terms of national security. We're number two. Because they have to keep the energy going to those places to keep it running. And I think in terms of mobile, it's a fascinating relationship between mobility and really, really static infrastructure.
And I think there's also potentially,
the
gentleman's point, sort of an interesting consideration about mobile. It almost is derived from a very tech-centric vision of things, because we think of something that was very static as now moving. But a lot of the interfaces that we're designing are now human-centric.
Yeah.
They go back to the very core essence of ourselves, to speech or touch, eye movement, neural interfaces. So this mobility, the point of this gentleman, mobile will probably disappear eventually as an attribute for interfaces because, we are mobile.
We are mobile, right.
So that's a given.
Yeah, indeed. And I think when these technologies are becoming such an integral part of the ways that we think about our bodies and think about our identities, and we being mobile creatures, I think that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Do you think there's a downside to interface becoming so seamless that our peers can actually no longer perceive how we interact with it? So, if I sit here with my Google glasses on, you wouldn't know, am I paying attention or reading a book, or maybe you're in a more private setting and you don't know if someone's actually recording you because he's just, steering the device with his eye movements or, maybe even his brain waves down the road, who knows?
Right. Yeah, indeed. And this is where I push people towards creative misuse because I think ultimately, I can load up a website on here and say, okay, well, let's read this together. That's ridiculous because it's an individual interface. It's designed for my look. And maybe, the two of us could look at a web page on my device. But for the most part, it's designed, its affordances are, for an individual, and its constraints are that it's for an individual. And I've seen some really fascinating projects tapping into that problem and using them and flipping it, inverting it, for example. There is an artist named Paul Notsold who has people text to him and then he projects it up on the sides of buildings. It becomes these huge projections that people walk by and send these text messages that become public art. Everybody's reading them. It's for a massive crowd. A text message that is meant for one individual then becomes very public. A project I had my students do just recently is along the lines of Improv Everywhere's, and I think Improv Everywhere's MP3 experiments are a really great example of this. Everybody downloads an MP3, and we meet at the same place, and at 4 p.m. we all hit play. And we're all listening to the same soundtrack. And this inverts these very private technologies, the individualized aspects of it, where on the subway, if you see somebody with headphones, that's a signal of, I'm kind of cocooning myself here, don't interact with me. please don't bother me. I'm in sort of my own pod right now, you know. And instead, what's happening is, can you find a way where everyone with their headphones is actually all on the same page? We're all interacting, and it's a really fascinating project where I had students running around the campus all doing the same thing, and they're all sort of isolated in their headphones, but it's a highly social event. So I think it's interesting to imagine the design of mobile interfaces, but then imagine the ways that those can be creatively misused to be social rather than highly individual. Because yeah, I think there are times where that does really become problematic, and it becomes one of the worst aspects of mobile media. You know, it took me quite a while to realize that. I have my students tweet constantly, and the first time I did this in 2007, I had everybody, a class of 35 students, tweet their activities throughout a week and have it sent to their phones via SMS. And so I was getting, you know, at least 35 tweets in a day, and I was driving to campus, and my wife was with me, and my phone would go off, and I'd read it and put it back in my pocket. My phone would go off. I mean, it was just going off nonstop. And then there was a student who wrote something funny, and I chuckled, and I put my phone away, and my wife turned to me and she said, "Would you stop doing that?" I said, "What?" I said, and then I explained the assignment to her like that was going to help. I said, well, you know, I'm trying to get them to understand how mobile devices can connect all of these people and blah, 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 blah. She says, it feels like there are secrets going on or whispers going on that I'm just not a part of. And it kind of dawned on me. I said, that makes sense, you know, because this activity is a very private activity. And I think that becomes kind of sometimes some of the worst aspects of it when it's really privatized. You know, it's a really private, highly individualized thing. And one of the things that I think is the great potential of mobile media is to move beyond that, to think of ways of connecting people. And I think these devices have some fantastic potential to move beyond that problem. Yeah.
I know recently, both the Samsung Derby and Apple are talking about having a wearable devices locks. That sort of goes back to the connection between the body and these devices. Do you think that those types of devices are going to sort of, you know, are they going in the right direction, or do you think that they're sort of novelty items?
Right. And I think it depends on how they ultimately get used. Because we are still very much a keyboard society. We are about writing things. We're writing more than we ever have in human history. And some of those devices don't necessarily address that need. So what will they be used for? It will depend on the affordances and constraints. What does it do well? It can't replace certain technologies. And the problem lies in, will they try to? You know, will these devices try to supplant mobile as we know it? And I think the problem is that the affordances of those devices don't necessarily match up with the ways that we're using our mobile devices now. So I think that, however, I think these devices will take off. I think we will see these, but it will be probably in very different ways than we're imagining it, which is maybe why I think broadly when a technology has a very slow adoption rate, it's often because the ways that we're designing it doesn't necessarily match up with its best uses, and it takes people to play with it and find out what it actually does well, rather than what I think it does well as the designer. You know.
So, listening to this conversation, we seem to be talking about it, and we seem to be talking about best, and it seems to me that everything's a multiplicity. Mm-hmm. It's not one thing going to replace my cell phone. It's a million things. Yeah. And I think there's three senses to think about, and whether things are where they're. So there's one of if this thing is or out in the ether is other, and I have to communicate to it or with it. Right. Or this thing expends me, and it helps me sense. Yeah. And then the other thing is this thing connects me to others. And I don't think any of them should be stuck in one bin or one device. Right. It's all going to be, you know, and we already are doing all these things. Like the iPhone is a sucky communicator, auditory. I mean, it's a bad phone. The newer ones are a little better. Yeah. You know, but So I think the conversation is
Yeah.
confining us.
Yeah, indeed. And one answer I've heard to that is the mobile phone is not a medium, is one response. It's an interface for a wide array of media. So you access media through your device is not the medium. And I think that's one interesting approach to thinking about that. And it perhaps takes a little bit off of this focus on a device and and begins to think of these interfaces, whatever they are, whatever they will become, are interfaces to a wide range of media, and then those media become meaningful. And based on the platform, based on the mobility, based on how they do change our social, spatial, embodied relationships with each other. Do those lights mean we're, yes, okay, yeah. Thank you, everybody, I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thanks. That was incredibly interesting, like always. So when Eric Groneman asked me to form this series last year, I said to him, well, sort of, what's the worst thing that can happen? And Eric said, well, one of your speakers cannot show up. And then he said, no, there's another one. 2 speakers can't show up. So we lost Google tonight. They would have learned a great deal from your lecture. Everybody go home and cancel your Gmail accounts. And I thank you for coming, and I hope you'll come the next time. We have a great speaker next time as well. Thank you very much.